Thank you, Wendy. Thanks to the faculty and students of Comparative American Studies for this invitation, and all of you for joining me here today. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my work. On Friday, July 9th, 2010, Cleveland residents awoke to this striking image when they unfolded their morning papers. The uniformed figure of Cleveland Cavaliers star LeBron James was walking away from them. In the upper right corner, a single word reported the news: gone. A thin straight line tied James's right hand to the italicized legend in the lower right corner: 7 years in Cleveland, no rings. Of course, the news was probably no news to many readers, since the night before, 1 in 4 Cleveland televisions was tuned in to an hour-long special program entitled The Decision, during which James ended fevered national speculation about his plans by announcing that he would be taking his talents to South Beach, that is, exercising his contractual right to join the Miami Heat. Some residents, mostly white and apparently with money, in the form of $100 jerseys to burn, had in fact already taken to the streets and become part of the news themselves. Nor were they alone in expressing harsh disapproval of James's decision. Cavaliers owner Dan Gilbert posted an open letter on the team's webpage excoriating James. Local sports writers chronicled and vented the anger of the region, and the Great Lakes Brewing Company even crafted a special ale, Quitness, which they declared would leave a bitter taste in your mouth. Nationally, James's Q score, used to measure public figures' popularity, plummeted in the wake of the decision. National columnists criticized the TV broadcast, the manner in which James handled his free agency period before his decision, and the effect it would have on his long-term reputation, all criticisms echoed by several prominent former NBA stars. This event, known simply as The Decision, is among those that students in my courses in sports, culture, and society most often want to talk about. They are eager to debate the decision, but frequently their initial opinions simply echo the oversimplifying judgments they encounter in the media. My job is to help them to get beyond these perspectives, to reflect critically on them, and in so doing, to approach in less confining and more expansive and empowering ways the issues that the decision, and sport more generally, can raise. To begin with, I encourage them to see that sport is not just a place to go for entertainment or escape, but also, as sociologists David Andrews and Ben Carrington write, a space charged with social significance and political possibilities for expressing who we are as individuals and the larger communities to which we belong. To help them visualize this relationship between sport and society, I invite my students to consider sport metaphorically as a swatch in the larger fabric of society, or, more dynamically, as a machine. At one end, the sport machine draws in raw materials in the form of capital, human bodies, and desires. Its component parts, labor, both athletic and otherwise, governmental bureaucracies, educational institutions, administrative organizations, and private manufacturing and communications and technology corporations then transform these raw materials to generate, at the other end, the performances, spectacles, images, and narratives that are consumed by hundreds of millions of sports fans around the globe on a daily basis, and that interpolate even those with no professed interest in sport. Carrington and Andrews go on to describe the task this machine presents my students and me. To think about sport as an escape from everyday life, whilst understanding that no cultural activity is completely autonomous from societal constraints. To examine sport as a form of cultural struggle, resistance, and politics, whilst recognizing that it is also compromised by forms of commodification, commercialization, and bureaucratic control. And to consider sport as an embodied art form that is formed in relation to both intrinsic and extrinsic goals and rewards that sometimes overdetermine the stated aims of the participants. This broad interdisciplinary challenge invites scholars and students from disciplines including the natural and social sciences, humanities, and the arts to critically examine often collaboratively, the components, operations, and products of the sport machine. As a humanities professor with expertise in contextualized literary and cultural analysis, I'm particularly interested in the sport machine's cultural products. After all, as critical theorists Susan Burrell and Mary MacDonald point out, everyone reads sport in some way. In the sense they mean that whether we are participants, fans, casual observers, or skeptics, our response to sport, as they put it, constitutes a particular reading. I therefore follow their suggestion for critically reading sport by finding the cultural meanings that circulate within narratives of particular incidents or celebrities. To do so, I first take as a point of departure what is perhaps the fundamental material fact of sport, the human body. But I understand the human body as a social and cultural site constructed by the intersection of power lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, age, nationality, ability, religion, and so forth. Then, as these material and symbolic differences are transformed by the sport machine into consumable narratives, it becomes vital, as Burrell and MacDonald put it, to pay critical attention to the ways that sexuality, race, gender, and class privileges are articulated in those accounts, and in particular to emphasize that they do not work independently and thus cannot be understood in isolation from one another. My own aim in doing so is threefold. First, to help my students understand how the sport machine works on them. But second, and equally importantly, I want them to recognize their role not only as consumers, but as producers of sports culture. And from there, lastly, I encourage them to create new stories and actively experiment with new modes of action in the world that better serve these purposes. After all, if sports really is a swatch in the fabric of society, then in changing the way we act in relation to sports, we begin to reweave not only its culture, but the broader social fabric of which sports is an inextricable part. By thus hacking the sports machine, we become not only passionate, but also informed, critical, and constructive social actors. I can say more in our Q&A about how sports, no less than other forms of popular culture or other social and political practices, can engage students of history, culture, and society and inspire in them critical thinking and social action. But I'd like to convey some sense of how this sort of intervention can work by offering a critical reading of the narratives the sports machine generated in the wake of the decision. The decision, as I said, prompted a storm of outrage from many quarters. Most opinions came accompanied by supporting narratives. Examining these, I was most struck by the recurrence of certain terms relating to gender and masculinity, but intersecting with racial and class discourses as well. In deploying these terms, critics expressed their disapproval of the decision by portraying James as falling short of various hegemonic norms of masculinity. I call this pattern of terms, viewed as an ensemble, the myth of the man. In trying to understand its operation, I organized the great variety of terms aimed in a derogatory way at LeBron James into sets according to the tropes or metaphors of manhood they employ. Specifically, the myth of the man comprises 4 sets of overlapping tropes of masculinity that its adherents accused James of violating. What I call sportsman tropes were mobilized most influentially by former athletes. In several interviews in the period following the decision, these influential legends commented that James, by leaving Cleveland to join rival stars in Miami, would now never be the man, and that even if he won championships in Miami, they would be meaningless because he would not have won them as the man. By the man, they had in mind an individual basketball player, perhaps like Michael Jordan, shown here, who upholds ideals of sportsmanship by accepting given external circumstances, whether or not they are favorable to winning championships, and labors with humility, determined will, and competitive intensity to rise above them. Regardless of outcome, it is through the quality of these efforts, Washington Post columnist Michael Wilbon agreed, that men are ultimately judged. But his detractors also referred to James in terms of immaturity. One former star described his behavior as a punk move. In this, he joined a chorus of critics who characterized James as not a man in the sense of not a grown man, but rather a child, by referring to him as, among other things, spoiled, immature, irresponsible, and coddled. They infantilized him by implying that he had received permission from his mother to make the decision, and Cleveland area writers patronized James by describing him as the ungrateful child of the region that had raised and loved him. Cavs owner Dan Gilbert was the first to mobilize noble codes of gentlemanly honor against James. In his open letter to fans, Gilbert referred to James as having deserted the team in a cowardly betrayal that he also described as a shocking act of disloyalty and a shameful display of selfishness and betrayal. Gilbert next reduced the price of life-size LeBron posters from $100 to $17.41, a price he explained represented the birth year of the first trader of note in American history, Benedict Arnold. Most observers joined in the use of such terms as jester, coward, and mercenary to describe James. Finally, journalists explicitly compared James to a woman. Thus, Maureen Dowd of the New York Times slyly mused of James and his new teammates, "It's usually women who get accused of needing to go places like restaurant bathrooms together." And another columnist, Sean Conboy, went further, writing, "In a world of attention whores, the king has ascended to the throne." But undoubtedly, the most spectacular expression of the myth of the man was this: a 300-page screed entitled The Whore of Akron, penned by Cleveland native Scott Robb. Robb employed the metaphor of prostitution as a gravitational center into which he drew all the other tropes that formed the myth of the man. As a metaphor, the term whore served Robb well because it bears, alongside the obvious connotation of femininity, a long-standing set of associations of duplicity and mercenary soullessness that resonate with other tropes already at work in the myth of the man. For 7 years, Robb explained, LeBron did the same thing as any trollop worth her taxi fare. He made the right noises, told us how good it felt, how big we were, how he loved us, how special we were. Oh, we knew that he was only a child. His vast sense of childish entitlement seemed to speak louder every season. But Lord, the sex was fine. In that passage, Robb yoked together femininity, duplicity, betrayal, and immaturity. Robb elsewhere combined the tropes of the whore and the child with the trope of ignoble treachery. The whore of Akron knows full well he has stomped on Cleveland's soul. He is a native son who betrayed the fatherland. Then, Robb ladled in tropes that refer to the sportsman, as when he writes, for example, he is a hideously poor sportsman, and more adept each season at acting every inch the prima donna bitch. All of this may seem so patently absurd that it raises the question of how the myth of the man could persuade anyone at all, let alone become the dominant cultural response to the decision. Understanding, and so disabling its power, requires an excavation of its deeper roots in the role that basketball has played in American society and culture. Basketball was invented in 1891 as a social reform initiative during the progressive era of American history. Concerned with the Gilded Era's widening gap between rich and poor arising amidst the country's rapid industrialization, urbanization, and immigration, as well as its imperialist intervention abroad, inventor James Naismith believed that organized play could contribute to social cohesion by cultivating moral traits important to white middle-class Christian men. Naismith saw these traits, cooperation, self-sacrifice, self-control, and sportsmanship, as universal values, and hoped that the popularity of the game would ensure their diffusion. The game was, in fact, wildly popular. YMCA instructors, Christian missionaries, and American military personnel spread basketball around the country and the world. But as the so-called city game was taken up by women, immigrants, African Americans, and others abroad, they adapted the sport to local conditions and reappropriated it to meet their own individual and collective physical, cultural, and social needs. As the sport diversified and the styles and purposes of play thus proliferated, contentious discussions arose among administrators, coaches, spectators, and journalists regarding the nature of the sport and the techniques and tactics that ostensibly best embodied and conveyed that nature. As these discussions evolved, clusters of recurrent stories, metaphors, and images began to appear and to attach themselves to key events and personalities. These clusters are what I call in my work myths, to frame them as narrative propositions, stories that, whether true or false, convey beliefs tenaciously held by their adherents. But these myths do more than convey beliefs. Like myth more generally, they also express cultural fantasies. In the case of the myths of the cultures of basketball, these fantasies arise from an unmanageable conflict in what I call the white basketball unconscious. This conflict stems from the fact that a game originally designed by and for white men in relation to social and moral goals pertaining to a white majority society and still primarily operated by white men for the entertainment of a white majority evolved over time to be dominated in terms of both on-court play and off-court cultural expression by black men. Moreover, and this is crucial, this change was simultaneously feared and desired by that white majority. The myths of the white basketball unconscious respond to this conflict by imagining an unchanging, intangible, tactical and moral essence of basketball, which they fantasize has existed continuously since the sport's invention 125 years ago, as in this holographic appearance of James Naismith at the 2016 NBA All-Star Game.
I first introduced my students to the game of basketball 125 years ago. I thought they might like it.
They then deploy this fantasized essence as a norm against which to judge the tactical and moral value of subsequent developments in the sport's history, and specifically to police innovations introduced by black players. In this way, the myths echo what Glyn Hughes calls the historical politics of the white imaginary in American society more broadly, in which cultural representations, as Hughes puts it, manage race through a choreography of proximity and distance to white norms and expectations so that good blacks are welcomed into the center of the American cultural life and bad blacks are condemned. Let me illustrate this with the example that is probably most pertinent to understanding the myths arising around the decision. As Michael Jordan piled up individual and team accomplishments in the late 1980s and 1990s, a consensus formed around the claim that he was the greatest player of all time. This unverifiable assertion rested in part on the view that Jordan resolved fundamental tensions in the culture of basketball, for example, between individual greatness and team success, but also on the belief that as a black athlete adored by white consumers, he demonstrated that America had overcome its racist history. But this myth of the greatest of all time also presupposed that history was over. In this, it echoed the broader political and economic claim, as exemplified in this best-selling book published in 1992, that in the wake of its Cold War victory, the American neoliberal empire was the greatest social order of all time. A claim seemingly confirmed by the dominant triumph of Jordan and the so-called Dream Team at the 1992 Summer Olympics. Yet the enormous weight of these investments also generated an anxious search for a basketball player and cultural figure who could bear these same cultural and social meanings once Jordan left the game. However, as the search unfolded, a new generation of black players, symbolized by Allen Iverson, rose to preeminence on the floor. Raised amidst the Reagan-era's decimation of America's urban cores, they unapologetically displayed cultural markers of their experiences and identities, such as tattoos, cornrows, and baggy shorts. The NBA and its supporting media structure warily eyed these newcomers, on the one hand, eager to tap the economic veins of a younger demographic, on the other, terrified to alienate the middle-class, white male consumer they had finally, through the figure of Jordan, managed to conquer. In this, the league exhibited the peculiar mix of tendencies that Bill Usman, analyzing the white consumption of hip-hop, called blackophilia and blackophobia. With this understanding of how these historical forces intersected to make basketball players both freighted and fraught sites of cultural meaning, we can examine more specifically the political and cultural investments, the desires and terrors that drove the white basketball unconscious to generate the myth of the man. Each of the four kinds of normative tropes of masculinity leveled against James reversed what basketball fans had originally adoringly attributed to him in the first place. For example, the duplicitous femininity attributed to James by man's man tropes reverses the prior fetish of LeBron as the ideal embodiment of hard masculinity. And, equally important, this physical power, which had previously been praised as useful, acquired in the course of and for the end of perfecting his craft, became, after the decision, a gaudy, unearned token of a false promise that would never be fulfilled. Indeed, I see all the qualities fans originally saw in James: sportsmanlike effort, preternatural maturity, and noble distinction, and that they subsequently reversed them through the tropes of the myth of the man as facets of a single quality: promise. As in, the promise fans imagined that LeBron James made, that he would satisfy their craving for another Michael Jordan. But consider these facts. LeBron James was born in 1984. That's the year the 21-year-old rookie Michael Jordan first set the league ablaze. As Jordan matured and began to pile up accolades, LeBron bounced around from one Akron project to another, moving 12 times between the ages of 5 and 8 in the Rust Belt detritus of the Reagan-Bush era. By the time Jordan retired for the second time in 1998, the consensus greatest of all time but with no heir in sight, James was 14 and just finishing 7th grade, but already causing a local buzz on his amateur athletic union youth team. As James's high school career took flight around the turn of the century, with the white basketball unconscious seized with panic by the hip-hop generation, the anxious search for the next Jordan amped up, and there we, and by we, I mean those fans and observers driven by the dreams and nightmares of the white basketball unconscious, there we found LeBron. From that moment, he never escaped our crosshairs. He was our chosen one, as in this Sports Illustrated cover story from LeBron's junior year in high school. We chose LeBron James to fulfill the promise of heir to Michael Jordan, the greatest of all time. We chose LeBron thereby to embody basketball perfection and the timeless perfection that is basketball. We chose to construct LeBron James as the second coming, our messianic imagery making him both man and God, and we chose to cast ourselves as passive witnesses. But this so-called conversation about the greatest of all times is first and foremost our conversation, a thing of our own making, a collective monologue. We played out a faux one-on-one battle with our MJ and LBJ dolls in which we kept it close, but we never really wanted Jordan to be surpassed or even equaled. LeBron's decision to go to Miami provided the pretext to disqualify him from our game, and petulantly toss him aside like an unwanted toy. From this point of view, LeBron's first affront, then, was to refuse to play passively his role in our drama. Instead, he took it seriously and acted it out. We called him the chosen one and King James, and he had the audacity to write both of these in his skin. Just think for a moment what it might mean in a country in which for generations white men gave black men their names, for a powerful, once poor young black man to appropriate these for himself and in so doing anoint himself Christ the King. In this way perhaps LeBron offended us by wanting to be the author of the drama we had scripted for him. And this leads me to the second of LeBron's transgressions. He took control of not only the cultural drama we had cast him in, but also of economic functions that we reserve for owners by arranging with fellow free agents Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh to accept pay cuts so as to be able to play together in Miami. As one TV executive said, explaining why everyone was going to root against Miami after the decision, these three players have attempted to hijack the league and said, we're all good buddies who are going to gang up and go to one team and dictate who wins championships. Economic self-determination and team formation, apparently, are privileges we reserve exclusively for white owners. At one level, this offended our deep national investment in the hierarchies of private property ownership within capitalism. What could be more offensive than workers colluding to determine without consulting their owners where they would work and which factory will be most productive? Well, how about if those workers were young, already highly paid black men? This specter of a workers' revolution or of a collective insurgency of poor African American men might well threaten mega-millionaire NBA owners, but the truth is that the vast majority of those who tore so viciously into LeBron James after the decision were not NBA owners. They were, rather, also workers who were bossed by owners of their own. And if they were offended by LeBron's decision, it might be because they lacked the courage or means to make the decision themselves, and they would be goddamned if some spoiled young black kid was going to get there first. This may be why two events following the decision whipped the ire of critics to an even greater pitch of intensity. First, just after the decision, when asked whether race played a part in the backlash to it, James mildly replied, "I think so, at times. There's always a race factor." Second, in June 2011, as the basketball world indulged in an orgy of schadenfreude over Miami's defeat in the NBA Finals, James was asked how it felt to have so many millions rooting against him. He responded calmly, "All the people that were rooting for me to fail, at the end of the day, tomorrow, they have to wake up and have the same life that they had before they woke up today. And I'm going to continue to live the way I want to live and continue to do the things I want to do." Perhaps James's comments struck too close to the heart of the white basketball unconscious. After all, while his Q score plummeted among white fans, it dipped only slightly among blacks. Through the myth of the man, the white basketball unconscious hysterically chanted like the boys in Lord of the Flies, intoxicated by unanimity, over and over again, "LeBron is not a man! LeBron is not a man!" The words resonated with the vitriolic resentment its adherents felt toward James, not because he failed to be a man, or the man, but because he behaved as a free man. By doing so, he forced them to see how the sport they loved ran smoothly only insofar as its black players agreed to limit their own freedom, and, more painfully still, the ways in which they were unfree in their own lives. And this exposes the burning core of emotion fueling the myth of the man. Henry Miller once observed, "Every day we slaughter our finest impulses." That is why we get a heartache when we read those lines written by the hand of a master and recognize them as our own, as the tender shoots which we stifled because we lacked the faith to believe in our own powers. This is the feeling Nietzsche called ressentiment. It means resentment, but the specific form of resentment we feel when someone else is doing what we wish we had the courage to do. At once exposed to and separated from what we could but will not do, we feel not inspiration, but pain. As the philosopher Gilles Deleuze explains, the man of ressentiment experiences beauty and goodness as outrageous as any pain or misfortune. He is venomous and depreciative because he blames the object in order to compensate for his own inability to escape. Or, in the words of poet William Blake, who also engraved these images, he who desires but acts not breeds pestilence. Ressentiment is what we feel when we have consented to our own enslavement, forgotten that we did it, and then despise those, like LeBron James, who have refused to do the same. Ressentiment burns, and so, Perhaps, to ease the searing pain, we burn what it is easiest for us to believe has caused our pain. This genealogy of the myth of the man reveals deeply rooted resentments, then, skewed along lines of race, class, and gender, toward LeBron James for exercising his power. I certainly believe that understanding this can help diffuse some of the myth's energy. But I also believe it is important to furnish an alternative story of the power of LeBron James, one that also carries affective force, but orients it in an affirmative direction. And there is no better place to find such a story than on the court, in the play of LeBron James. Chris Ballard of Sports Illustrated concluded his book, The Art of a Beautiful Game, with a chapter devoted to the anatomy of LeBron James, in which he described James as the apex of physical skill. And it is a skill, Ballard continued, that is married to an innate feel for the game. Here is a man who passes like a point guard, runs like a sprinter, leaps like a high jumper, and hits like a linebacker. If you were to create the prototype for the NBA player of the future, it would look an awful lot like James. Ballard voiced what has always amazed fans about James's play. All the qualities exhibited by different individual greats in the history of basketball seem to come together in James. He combines athletic ability, hard work, creativity, fundamental skills, and the IQ and unselfishness to do everything or just that one thing that his team needs on a given night. But to say that LeBron embodies the best of basketball that preceded him is to recognize that he stands as a kind of threshold between basketball as we have known it, with all of its possibilities and limitations, and a future version of itself that will still be called basketball, but whose precise dimensions and forms we cannot yet imagine. In other words, rather than a second coming of Jordan, whose greatness, recall, signaled the end of time, and so an infinitely repetitive one-on-one game of the peerless Jordan narcissistically playing himself as in this Gatorade commercial, James may be Jordan's antithesis. LeBron is not the individualistic Nietzschean Superman who presides alone over the end of history, but rather a Promethean figure who seizes the throne only to set history and time back in motion and thus usher in unforeseen futures. Now watch LeBron play. He will be number 23 or number 6 and will be the player making the assist, that is, passing the ball to the person making the basket. His court vision, passing ability, and unfailing selflessness on the court, more than his strength or speed, may be the best emblem for his power. Notice how LeBron uses the threat he poses as a scorer to draw a crowd of defenders only to spot the teammate thereby left unguarded. Notice how he uses his imagination, strength, and skill to precisely deliver the ball in just the place his teammate needs in order to score. No player before LeBron James has combined his capacity to dominate a game individually by scoring with his creative ability and eagerness to do so instead by sharing the ball with teammates. Michael Jordan once dismissed his Hall of Fame coach's efforts to get him to share the ball as an equal opportunity offense. By contrast, James is the player who deploys his strengths to create opportunities for others. And, despite the criticism he has received for this cooperative style of play, LeBron insisted, even in the depths of his darkest moment, on the night of the decision, that in the NBA, you become a superstar individually, but you become a champion as a team. James here articulated what he has consistently demonstrated on the court from high school to the present, that individual greatness is no end in itself. It is a means, on and off the court, to elevate a community. Which brings me to July 2014. When James exercised his free agency once again, this time to leave the Miami Heat and return home to northeastern Ohio, to the Cleveland Cavaliers, to the very same owner who had slandered him, to the very same fans who had burned his jersey. He even let those fans choose whether he would wear the number 6, as he had in Miami, or the number 23, as he had during his first 7 seasons in Cleveland. They chose 23, Jordan's number, and in accepting their choice, he allowed them, in effect, to unburn their jerseys. The story they told of this return of the king was that LeBron had grown up, come to his senses, and come home to win one for hard luck Cleveland, for hard-working Believeland, whose last major sports title came in 1964. Maybe. But I think LeBron told a better story when upon his return he reflected on his original decision to leave. Remember, he recalled, when I was sitting up there at the Boys and Girls Club in 2010, I was thinking, this is really tough. I could feel it. I was leaving something I had spent a long time creating. If I had to do it all over again, I'd obviously do things differently, but I'd still have left. I became a better player and a better man. I learned from a franchise that had been where I wanted to go. Maybe LeBron left Cleveland because he knew he had something to learn before he could use his strengths to deliver the title to Cleveland, and that he could learn that something only by leaving home. Maybe LeBron loved Cleveland so much that he left and suffered the hatred of the hoops universe so that he could return more powerful than before to lend that power to the region he loved. In combining this affirmation of individual autonomy with a lived sense of collective responsibility, James may be the basketball heir to Baruch Spinoza, the 17th century philosopher who condemned traditional morality, which he argued depended on ignorance and fostered slavish obedience, in favor of a communitarian ethics of self-awareness, radical freedom, and joy. Spinoza's ethical vision, like James's game, is predicated on the relationship, on the interconnected interdependence of all beings, like players on a team. Understanding how our encounters with others affect us and vice versa is at the root of this vision. It is why, in Spinoza's ethics, that individual will be called good, who strives to join with whatever agrees with his nature, and thereby to increase his power. But for the goodness thus cultivated by the free individual to merit its name, Spinoza insisted, it must be common to all and enjoyed by all equally. Remember LeBron asserting on the night of the decision, you become a superstar individually, but you become a champion as a team. Spinoza agreed. Perhaps this underlying ethos has shaped James's growing role in what Dave Zirin, sports columnist for The Nation, sees as a resurgence of athletes speaking publicly on matters of social justice. The myths of basketball culture function as what Deleuze calls an apparatus of capture, a kind of net used to arrest the experimental creative force of players and the unpredictable, chaotic flow of the game. Thus, we tried to capture LeBron James by plotting him on a graph established by Jordan. But maybe all along he was changing the rules of the game, inaugurating a new order with new standards. In this sense, perhaps he is a traitor. Not in the derogatory sense implied by the petty and petulant complaints of his resentful critics, but a traitor, in Deleuze's words, to the established order. Perhaps LeBron James betrayed the racializing, pseudo-moral order constructed through the myths of basketball culture and gave it an inventive, emancipatory twist. And perhaps this is the way in which he remains, like each one of us when we are able to recall it, radically free, not only as individuals, but as responsible and responsive members of our communities in which the well-being of each is the precondition for the well-being of all. Thank you.